Red Bull Racing are your 2023 F1 Constructors World Championship winners, and the trophy is on its way back to Milton Keynes for the second year in a row. And if we're being honest, I think it was about halfway through testing when we all realised that was going to be the result this year. But for the Japanese Grand Prix, it needed to be a statement drive for Red Bull. After the week running in Singapore, they were back with a point to prove. And that statement drive was pretty much exactly what we saw. Verstappen claimed pole by a huge margin and put nearly 8 tenths on his teammate Perez. And he said in the cool-down room that he doesn't really like podcasts, and maybe that was why he took a break from winning in Singapore. And of course, also in Japan, the more dramatic result was probably the double podium for McLaren and Oscar Piastri's first in Formula 1, outscoring McLaren, Ferrari and Aston Martin all in this round. Their trend line is the best of the rest at the moment when we look at the direction of the championship. It might be too little too late this year, but it could mean a fast start in 2024. But behind Red Bull and the McLarens, it was a real strategy battle between Mercedes and Ferrari. We saw pretty quickly in the opening laps that George's confidence and determination to make the overtake was matched pretty equally by Lewis's willingness to get his elbows out and defend. First in a wheel-to-wheel battle lasting from the final chicane all the way to the apex of turn 1, and then later Lewis ending up making a Verstappen-style block on George at Spoon Corner, heading onto the back straight. George Russell's strategy was the one-stopper. He ran the mediums until lap 24 and then did the remaining 29 laps on the hards, and it was important for him to maximise pace in this drive after the late mistake in Singapore. It was potentially a win-costing mistake, so he was back with a vengeance with a point to prove. And because he was on the one-stopper, midway through the race, George led as best of the rest before the two McLarens and Charles Leclerc got back past him on the two-stopper. Now on the other hand, Lewis Hamilton was on the two-stopper. Lewis was coming in also with a point to prove after Singapore. He was lap for lap faster than Russell and must, at least on some level, think that he could have won that race. He ended up finishing third, but you know he was looking at that top stop of the podium, thinking that's where I used to be and that's where I should be right now. On the two-stopper then, Lewis also started on the mediums, but ran them for a shorter stint of 16 laps, did a further 18 on a first set of hards, and then the remaining 19 on the final set. And it's an old quote in Formula 1, that when you split your strategies, you're guaranteeing that one of them will be wrong. And it feels pretty accurate in this context here. It was a characteristically chaotic run down to turn 1 at Suzuka, as we saw here Lewis get pushed wide onto the grass, have to lift off of it and avoid coming into contact with Perez. Now the main talking point here when we look at the Mercedes strategy in Japan was the position swapping at the end of the race, and it was something that Sky commentator Anthony Davidson pointed out almost immediately. In some ways, it was actually carrying over an idea that Carlos Sainz used last week to help him keep in the lead at the Singapore Grand Prix. George was in front on tyre cycle, but Lewis was coming back through after his second stop, with Sainz behind him on a mirroring strategy. And the DRS zone is particularly effective in Japan, as it's basically the only efficient overtaking zone. You can try it at the chicane or you can try it at the hairpin, but they're more costly, more risky, as we saw with Sergio Perez and Kevin Magnussen. So George was first told to let Lewis pass, but what he wanted to do was keep Lewis behind him in his DRS, allow the two to pull away from Sainz, then let Lewis pass on the final lap. But Lewis was feeling impatient, he didn't want to wait behind George, and he couldn't be sure that George would actually let him back past. The team ordered George to swap positions, they did so. Lewis tried to then afterwards give George the DRS to defend from Sainz, but it didn't work and Sainz got past. In points terms then, Ferrari started 4th and 6th and finished 4th and 6th, scoring 20 points in total, but Perez's DNF gifted effectively one free place to Sainz, so in a way it's a net loss of one place on track. But with Charles Leclerc ahead in P4, it means that overall, Ferrari did outscore Mercedes by 4 points in Japan. Mercedes then started further back in 7th and 8th, and they finished in 5th and 7th. Therefore, Lewis getting ahead of Sainz means it's a net single position gain for them once Perez is factored in. It's good for Lewis's side of the garage, but it means overall they only scored 16 points to Ferrari's 20. And if they'd managed to keep Sainz behind rather than letting him get through on George, it would have been 18 points apiece for the two teams rather than a 4-point split going to Ferrari. Bradley Lord, the Mercedes communications director and F1 veteran, reflected to Ted Kravitz at the end of the race with a characteristically diplomatic and comms director style answer to the Mercedes on-track battle. He said that they raced each other hard on a hard racing track, and it's easy to read a lot into those radio messages in the heat of the moment. As always, we talk about it away from the pressure and the high temperatures of the cockpit in the debrief after. That's where anything that needs tidying up gets tidied up. But it's really critical from here on out for Mercedes to outscore Ferrari if they want to keep that P2 in the championship like we talked about last week. Any DNF or any more after Singapore will be literally costly with prize money on the table. Currently, the margin is 20 points between the two, and you never know, it could all come down to those 4 missed points because of the position swap mistake. So here's what your title standings look like now with Red Bull locked in as champions. Lewis spoke post-race about the need for a super strong 6 months of development before the green flag flies next year. Fundamentally, when the customer teams like Aston Martin and McLaren are as close as they are, it's almost a good and a bad thing at the same time. It means your engine is good and where it needs to be, fast enough to compete through all the heat, reliability and etc. But it also proves to some extent the underperformance of your chassis and aero packages if McLaren are beating you with the same engine. Either way though, it's still a long way till the end of the season, and we'll be covering all the headlines here on the Crash F1 YouTube channel and our website crash.net with coverage from all across the racing world. Thank you very much for watching. Make sure you subscribe to this channel and turn on the notifications so you never miss a video from us here at the team.